Hi Year 3! Mrs Horner read you some Ice Palace yesterday, and I'm going to continue reading this story for your learning today. That evening at supper time, while his mother and father were not looking, Ivan took some of the dark bread from the big wooden board on the table and slipped it into his pocket. Then he said, "Mother, I am very tired. I will sleep now." His mother lighted a candle for him, and he carried the little flame into his room. I feel like Ivan might be up to something here. For a long time he sat on his bed, listening to the small noises of his parents made beyond the door of his room, and to the wind outside. The wind made a sad, lonely sound, and as he listened, it seemed to Ivan that something was crying out there in the night. Something small and frightened that touched his window and moved away along the wall. And he lifted a corner of the window curtain and pressed his face to the cold glass and whispered, "Wait, little brother, I will not leave you. I am coming." His breath made a cloud on the glass, and there was only the wind. He let the curtain fall, blew out his candle, and climbed into bed without taking off his clothes. After a while, the door of his room was opened quietly, and Ivan pretended to be sleeping, while his mother smoothed his quilt, kissed him, and went out, closing the door behind her. Soon after that, the unhappy couple went to their room, and the house was still. Ivan slipped out of bed and pulled on his boots. Then he took his fur parka and moved quietly to the door. Moments later, he was across the warm, dark kitchen and out into the freezing wind. Next morning, the people were awakened by a terrible cry from the blacksmith's house. Oh my goodness, maybe they think that Starjik's taken him. The blacksmith's wife had crept early into Ivan's room and found his bed empty. All that day the people stood about the village in groups, talking, but nobody had heard Starjik come again, and nobody could remember having known anyone as unlucky as the blacksmith and his wife. And far away through the forest and over the hill walked Ivan. He wore his fur parka, and between his teeth he held a squirrel tail, for if he had not, the wind would have frozen his breath into a mask of ice on his face. I can't even imagine how cold that must be. I've never even heard of that happening to somebody before. Ivan was afraid. He was more afraid than he had ever been, for nobody has ever seen Starjik's land, and lived to return home. His head was bowed, and he cried a little as he went along, and his tears became pips of ice before they touched the snow. He was afraid, and sometimes he almost turned around to follow his footprints back to his father's house. But then he would see in his mind a picture of his brother, holding out his arms and crying, in a place that was cold beyond imagining. And then Ivan would brush away his tears and go on. On and on he went, and when it began to grow dark, he found a snowdrift and tunnelled into it, as his father had taught him. Outside, the screaming wind drove blizzards of snow across the darkness, but Ivan slept safe and warm in his shelter. When morning came, he dug himself out, ate a little food from his pocket, and looked all around. His footprints were gone, and the wind had shifted the snowdrifts into a new pattern so that he could not tell which way he had come. He sighed, turned his face into the wind, and walked on. The snow was deeper now, and Ivan's feet sank far beneath its surface with every step. He began to feel tired and to wonder if he would ever see home again. He was thinking longingly about his chair by the big hot stove, when there came a sound that felt like an icicle in his heart. It was the long, thin cry a hungry wolf makes when it scents its prey. Oh no! The cry was answered by another, and soon the pine wood echoed with the howls of the hunting pack. Now, I remember that Starjik had a pack of wolves pulling his sled, so I really hope that's not Starjik. Ivan tried to go faster, but the snow stuck at his boots, making him stumble. He looked back, sobbing. His footprints wound away beneath the trees, and somewhere back there he knew the wolves were running in his tracks, with their noses down to smell him out. A tree! He must find a tree to climb. Wolves can outrun any living thing, but they cannot climb trees. He stumbled on, looking wildly around him, but the trees just here were all pines with smooth, icy trunks. The wolf cries drew nearer. He looked back. Dim shapes moved in the dark beneath the trees. He plunged forward, gasping. They had seen him now. A few seconds more, and they would be upon him. He glanced all about and ploughed through the snow, the wolves at his heels. He leapt, his hands closed around the lowest branch, and he swung his legs clear of the ground as the first wolf lunged in a flurry of snow. Painfully, Ivan hauled himself into the ice-lacquered branches and sat, gazing down. The wolves milled, snarling, around the foot of the tree. Their slavering jaws were upturned, and their breath rose in plumes all around him. Now and then a wolf would leap, its jaws snapping within inches of his feet. Soon Ivan began to feel cold. The wind whipped through the bare branches, and his dangling legs became numb. Soon he knew the frost would be in his fingers. It would spread through his hands until they could no longer grip, and he would fall into that whirling mass of fur and fangs. "Go away!" he cried. "Oh, go away and find something else to kill!" But the wolves gazed at him with their cruel eyes, and their jaws seemed to grin. "They know," sobbed Ivan. "They know that I am freezing. They are waiting for me to fall." He clung desperately to his perch. The cold began to seep through his hands. He cried softly, and his tears froze on his cheeks. "Farewell, little brother," he whispered. "I can never save you now." His eyes felt heavy, and his head sank slowly until his chin rested on his chest. He was going to sleep. The cold was going away. He smiled a little. He had only to let go now, and he could sleep and sleep until the end of the world. A startled yelp roused him. He shook his head and looked down. The wolves were scattering in all directions, and in their midst, rearing on its hind legs, was a huge bear. Its terrible claws hissed through the air, and the wolves fell back, snapping. The bear lunged at them, and they turned tail, slipping away between the frozen trees. Ivan cried out joyfully, then gasped with horror. Bears kill people. And bears can climb. He pulled up his feet, trying to move higher. The bear dropped onto its four feet, and stood a moment, snarling into the forest. Then, with only an upward glance at the boy, it leaped off, melting soon among the shadows of the pines. Stiffly, Ivan climbed down. He peered fearfully all around, but the wolves were gone, and there was no sign of the bear.